The Duke of Northumbria had every woman in Bradford available to him, and chose the one no man had ever pursued. Society did not laugh. They simply went quiet, because everyone already knew what Eliza Marin was. They just never imagined anyone would want to marry her for it. Eliza was 31, unmarried, and the most quietly indispensable person in 3 counties. Not because of any warmth that drew people in, but because of a particular kind of competence that others quietly depended on and rarely acknowledged out loud. When the Gordons' eldest son had entangled the family name in a reckless land dispute, it was Eliza who had drafted the resolution. When the Merriweather estate had fallen into disorganized debt after the old lord's death, Eliza had spent 2 months untangling the ledgers before anyone thought to thank her. She did not seek gratitude. She sought order, and she produced it with a precision that made people uneasy in the way that true competence sometimes does. She had not always lived like this. At 22, she had entered society with the ordinary expectation that a woman of her standing would, quietly, hopefully, waiting for the process to select her. It never did. Her father, a minor gentleman with a respectable but unremarkable name, had arranged introductions. Eliza had attended assemblies with patience, then with less patience, then with nothing at all. No offers came. No courtship developed. The absence was never dramatic. It was simply a door that no one opened, year after year, until she stopped standing beside it. Her younger brother, William, had married at 24, a clean, uncomplicated match that required none of the family's energy beyond a single letter of introduction. Eliza had organized the celebration, managed the guest correspondence, and ensured the day moved without interruption. She had done it well, as she did everything, and no one had needed to say so. By 30, she had stopped framing her life as a delay before something else began. Instead, she had built something of her own, small at first, then wider. Estate consultations, household restructuring, a network of families who called on her not out of charity but out of necessity. Duke George of Northumbria had governed Northumbria for 9 years, with a reputation for cold precision and zero tolerance for sentiment. He had declined every match ever arranged for him, not from indifference, but from a standard no candidate had yet met. George, Duke of Northumbria, did not make decisions quickly. He made them correctly. This was the distinction his household had learned to observe over 9 years of his governance. Other men deliberated. George calculated. Where another duke might weigh sentiment against obligation, George weighed outcome against outcome, and chose the one that produced the stronger position. It made him effective. It made him difficult to read. It made him, in the estimation of most people who dealt with him, cold. Though George himself would have found that word imprecise. He was not cold. He was simply uninterested in the parts of human interaction that did not produce results. Marriage had been on his list of calculations for 3 years. Not because he wanted it. He wanted what it could produce. A household that functioned at the level his estates demanded. A partner who could operate independently within his sphere of influence. And a presence at his side that would satisfy the political expectations of his position without requiring him to perform emotions he did not feel. He had reviewed candidates the way he reviewed land acquisitions. Thoroughly, systematically, and without sentiment. The first season had yielded nothing. Lady Catherine Ashworth was accomplished but dependent. She required constant social validation, and George had no interest in supplying it. Miss Davies was intelligent, but erratic, her judgment undermined by impulse. The Countess Tricia's daughter was well-connected and entirely uninterested in the administrative realities of running a northern estate. George had dismissed each of them within a single conversation, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for negotiation. The second season was worse. Word had spread that the Duke's standard was not charm or social standing. It was capability. This narrowed the field considerably, because most women in Bradford had been raised to excel at the former, and had never been given the opportunity to develop the latter. It was Oliver Cranmore, George's estate manager, and one of the few men whose counsel George actually sought, who first mentioned Eliza Marin. "She is not what you expect," Oliver said. He was not a man who wasted words on recommendation, which was precisely why George listened. George asked for a summary. Oliver provided one. Unmarried, minor family, no title, no significant dowry. But she had restructured 3 estates in 2 years, resolved a land dispute the Harringtons' own solicitors had failed to untangle, and built a network of household consultations that functioned with an efficiency George recognized immediately because it mirrored his own approach to governance. George did not seek her out at a ball or an assembly. He arranged to observe her at work. He attended a meeting at the Whitmore estate under the pretext of inspecting a neighboring property. Eliza was in the library, reviewing tenant ledgers with the estate's steward. She did not notice him arrive. She was focused, not with the performative concentration of someone aware of being watched, but with the genuine absorption of a mind engaged entirely with the problem before it. George watched for 20 minutes. He listened to 3 exchanges between Eliza and the steward. He noted the precision of her questions, the absence of hesitation, the way the steward deferred to her without any visible prompt. He left before she looked up. That evening, he told Oliver to send a formal inquiry to the Marin household regarding marriage negotiations. Oliver raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. He had learned over 4 years of service that George's decisions were rarely wrong, only occasionally surprising. The announcement reached Bradford on a Wednesday. By Thursday, every drawing room in the county had a theory. The most common one was charity. Surely the Duke had made an error, or, more generously, had extended some form of quiet mercy to a woman whose circumstances were unremarkable. Lady Tricia, who hosted the largest gatherings in the region and considered herself the county's most reliable narrator of other people's lives, declared at her Thursday salon that the match was a kindness dressed as a contract. Her guests nodded. It was a satisfying explanation. It allowed everyone to feel sympathetic toward Eliza without having to examine why no one had thought to offer her a match themselves. The second theory was stranger and more persistent, that Eliza had done something to compel the Duke's hand. What that something might be, no one could specify. But the suspicion existed. Quiet, shapeless, the kind of rumor that does not name itself but colors every subsequent conversation. George of Northumbria did not do things without reason. If he had chosen Eliza Marin, the assumption was that she had given him one. Eliza heard about both theories on the same afternoon, delivered by Mrs. Thornton, the wife of a neighboring landowner who visited under the guise of congratulation, but whose interest was clearly investigative. "Everyone is so pleased for you," Mrs. Thornton said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. "Though I confess, we are all quite curious. The Duke is not known for choosing, based on the usual criteria." Eliza poured more tea. "The usual criteria did not seem to interest him, no. And you are not, forgive me, you have never been particularly visible in society. Not that there is anything wrong with that," Mrs. Thornton added quickly. "It is simply unexpected. Most useful things are," Eliza said. She said it without emphasis, as a simple observation, and Mrs. Thornton left 20 minutes later with nothing she had not already known and no new material to carry back to Lady Tricia's salon. The whispers did not bother Eliza. They had never bothered her. She had spent years operating in rooms where people discussed her without addressing her, and she had developed, over that time, a particular kind of detachment. Not indifference exactly, but a refusal to grant other people's assessments any weight in how she understood herself. What occupied her attention was not what Bradford thought of the match. It was what the match meant, practically. George had been clear in their single formal meeting before the engagement was announced. He had laid out his expectations with the same directness she recognized in her own work. He wanted a capable partner, not a performing one. He wanted someone who could manage a household and participate in decisions without requiring instruction. He wanted, in short, exactly what she already was. She had one question for him during that meeting, and she asked it plainly. "What do you expect from me personally?" beyond the household. George had considered this for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the care he took with accuracy. Nothing beyond what you choose to offer, he said. I am not looking for a wife in the conventional sense. I am looking for a capable partner. If that is something you can accept, then we have an agreement. Eliza had accepted, not because the terms were generous, because they were honest. And honesty, in her experience, was rarer than generosity. The ceremony was held on a gray Saturday in October. It was not a lavish affair. George had no interest in spectacle, and Eliza had no one who would have expected it. The guests were few. Oliver Cranmore and his wife, Theodore Hale, a handful of the families Eliza had worked with over the years, and George's solicitor, who attended out of professional duty rather than sentiment. The reception was brief. They left together and arrived at the Northumbria estate by early evening. The house was well maintained and quietly intimidating, not because of its size, but because of the order that governed every room. Each part functioned exactly as designed. Eliza recognized the system immediately. She had built smaller versions of it herself. They dined together. The conversation was functional. George asked about her work with the Harrington family, listened with genuine attention, and offered a single observation about tenant law that showed he had read more about her background than she had expected. After dinner, they moved to the study. George poured wine, 1 glass each, and sat across from her in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. The room was warm. The light was low. He did not move closer. I want to be clear about something before tomorrow, he said. Eliza set down her glass. She waited. This marriage is a partnership. I chose you because you are capable, and I intend to treat you as an equal within this household. You will have autonomy over any sphere you wish to manage. You will have access to resources, information, and decisions that most wives in this county would never be permitted to see. He paused, not for effect, to ensure she was following the terms precisely. What I will not do is pretend to feel something I do not. I respect you. I believe this arrangement will function well. But I will not offer affection I cannot honestly provide. And I will not perform a version of this marriage that would require me to. The fire crackled. Eliza looked at him, not with hurt, not with surprise. She looked at him the way she looked at a contract, reading for accuracy. You are telling me not to expect love, she said. Yes, from this marriage. From me. Specifically. Eliza considered this. George did not fill the silence, and she did not feel the need to either. They were two people who had both learned, in different ways, that silence was not uncomfortable when it was occupied by people who did not require each other's reassurance. Then what should I expect, Your Grace? She asked. The question was not plaintive. It was practical. The same tone she used when reviewing a contract clause she needed clarified before signing. Respect, George said. Autonomy, a role that is real, not ceremonial, and a husband who will not waste your time with performances neither of us needs. Eliza nodded once. She picked up her wine again. Then we have an agreement, she said. George met her eyes. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but registering. Recognition, perhaps, that the woman across from him had just accepted terms that would have undone most people, and had done so without flinching. We do, he said. They finished their wine. They said goodnight. The evening ended without drama. Two people who had agreed to something unusual, and who both understood that the agreement was only the beginning. Eliza did not sleep well that first night, but not for the reasons anyone would have assumed. It was not grief. It was not loneliness. It was not the sting of a husband's rejection, repackaged as honesty. George had been straightforward, and she respected that. What kept her awake was something more productive. She was thinking. The bedroom was large, cold at the edges, and furnished with the same precise, impersonal quality as the rest of the house. A fire had been laid but not lit. Eliza did not call for a servant to light it. She pulled the blanket higher and lay in the dark, running calculations. George had offered her autonomy. He had meant it. She was confident of that. But autonomy, she understood from years of working within other people's households, was only as large as you made it. No one would hand her influence. She would have to build it the same way she had built everything else. Quietly, systematically, without waiting for permission she had already been given. By the time dawn arrived, gray and thin through the curtains, she had the outline of a plan. It was not a grand plan. Grand plans drew attention before they produced results, and attention invited interference. What she had instead was a sequence of steps, each one designed to expand her position without announcing that she was doing so. The first step was the estate ledgers. George managed Northumbria's finances through a system that was functional but inefficient. A patchwork of records maintained by 3 separate stewards, none of whom communicated consistently with the others. Eliza had noticed the gaps during dinner the night before, when George had mentioned a tenant dispute in the Eastern Holdings that his steward had failed to flag until it was 2 months old. It was not negligence. It was structure. The information existed, but it was not flowing to the people who needed it. She could fix that. It was exactly the kind of problem she had spent a decade solving. The second step was relationships, not social ones. George had made it clear that the household's social obligations were managed by his secretary, and Eliza had no interest in competing with drawing-room politics. What she wanted was operational relationships. The stewards, the tenants, the local merchants who supplied the estate. Oliver Cranmore, whom she had already met, and who had clearly advocated for her selection, would be a natural starting point. Theodore Hale, George's land surveyor, was another. She needed to understand how Northumbria functioned from the ground up before she could improve it from above. The third step was visibility, but the right kind. Not the visibility of a duchess at a dinner party. The visibility of someone whose decisions produced results that other people noticed and remembered. A tenant dispute resolved faster than expected. A supply chain that ran without interruption through winter. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things that built a reputation the way water builds a riverbed, gradually, invisibly, and permanently. This was not rebellion. George had offered a fair exchange, and she intended to honor it. But he had married a woman who did not need his love to function. He had married a woman who needed only a door left open. And Eliza Marin had spent a very long time learning exactly what to do once a door was open. She rose before the household stirred and went downstairs to find the estate records. No one saw her leave the bedroom. No one needed to. The records were kept in 3 separate rooms. This was the first problem. The Eastern Holdings reported to Steward Dennett. The Western Holdings reported to Steward Marsh. The central farms and household accounts were managed by a clerk named Pritchard, who communicated with neither of the other 2 unless something had already gone wrong. By the time information reached anyone who could act on it, it was usually too late to act effectively. Eliza spent her first week simply reading. She did not rearrange anything. She did not propose changes. She sat in the estate office each morning with a cup of tea and a fresh ledger, and she mapped what existed before she touched what needed to change. Oliver found her there on the 4th day, surrounded by open books, a sheet of paper covered in her own shorthand in front of her. "You are not sleeping much," he observed. "I am sleeping enough." She did not look up. "Oliver, when was the last time someone compared the Eastern crop yields against the Western supply orders in the same document?" He considered this. "I don't believe anyone has." "Then that is where we begin." She did not rewrite the ledgers. That would have required the cooperation of 3 stewards, each of whom had organized their records according to years of habit. Instead, she created a single monthly summary that pulled figures from all 3 sources and presented them side by side. The first one took 6 days. By the 3rd month, it took her an afternoon. The summary revealed what the separate records had hidden: patterns. The Eastern Holdings were producing more grain than the Western Holdings could process before spoilage set in. Two farms in the central holdings were consistently underpaying their tenant agreements, not through dishonesty, but because their contracts had been written against outdated market rates. A supply route to the northern mill was adding 3 days to delivery times that could be cut to 1 with a simple adjustment to the loading schedule. They were inefficiencies, quiet, cumulative, the kind of losses no single steward would have flagged because each one, in isolation, seemed too small to report. Together, they cost the estate a measurable amount every month. Eliza brought the first summary to George on a Tuesday evening. She placed it on his desk without ceremony and pointed to the figures she had underlined. "These are correctable," she said. "If you authorize the changes, I can implement them within the month." George read the document. He did not rush. When he finished, he looked at her, not with surprise, but with something closer to confirmation. "Do it," he said. She did. Charles Wentworth was not a man who tolerated change quietly. He was the largest landowner in the northern holdings, a distant cousin of George's through marriage, and a member of the informal council of estate advisors that George consulted on matters of regional governance. He was also, by temperament, a man who believed that the way things had been done was the way they should continue to be done, not out of laziness, but out of a genuine conviction that disruption was inherently suspect. When word reached him that the Duchess had begun restructuring the estate's reporting systems, he came to Northumbria unannounced. Eliza was in the office when he arrived. She did not rise to greet him. She was reviewing the revised tenant contracts for the central holdings, and she finished the page she was reading before she acknowledged his presence. "Mrs. Wentworth informed me you have been interfering with the estate accounts," Charles said. He did not sit. He stood near the door, which was, Eliza noted, a posture designed to suggest he had not come to stay long, only to deliver a warning and leave. "I have been organizing them," Eliza corrected. "They were not interfered with. They were consolidated. The stewards report to the Duke." "They do, and the Duke has authorized every change I have made." She set down her pen. "If you have a concern about the new systems, I am happy to walk you through them. You will find the figures are more transparent than they were before, not less." Charles did not sit down for the walkthrough. He left within 10 minutes, but he did not leave quietly. Over the following week, Eliza heard, through Oliver, who heard it from Theodore, who heard it from a merchant at the northern mill, that Charles had raised objections at the regional council meeting. The Duchess was overstepping. The new systems were untested. Tradition existed for a reason. George, when informed, listened to the objections in full. Then he asked Oliver to compile the comparative figures. Estate revenue, before Eliza's changes and after. The numbers were not close. "Tell Charles," George said, "that he is welcome to review the data himself. The office is open." Charles did not visit the office again. But his resistance did not disappear. It simply moved elsewhere, quieter, more indirect, the kind of opposition that works not through confrontation, but through slow, persistent friction. Eliza recognized it immediately. She had seen it in Bradford, in households where the person with the least visible power was also the person most carefully watched. She did not let it slow her down. She simply worked faster. The opportunity came in February, when the Northern Mill contract came up for renewal. It was not a large contract by the estate's standards, grain processing for the central holdings, a modest but necessary arrangement that had been renewed on the same terms for 11 years. No one had questioned it. The mill was reliable, the price was acceptable, and renegotiating meant inconvenience. Eliza questioned it. She had been tracking the delivery time since her first month at Northumbria, and the pattern was clear. The mill was slow, not because of capacity, but because of scheduling. Their largest client, a neighboring estate owned by one of Charles's associates, received priority on processing days. The Northumbria grain waited. The delay was never long enough to cause visible damage, but it was long enough to matter, compounded across 12 months, to the overall efficiency of the supply chain. She did not approach Charles's associate. She approached Theodore Hale, who knew the regional mills well, and asked him to identify alternatives. Theodore returned with one clear option: a mill in the Eastern District that was newer, faster, and willing to negotiate a rate 10% lower than the current contract. The new contract was signed in March. The processing time dropped by 4 days. The cost dropped by the amount Eliza had calculated it would. The grain arrived at the holdings on schedule for the first time in years, and the stewards, who had quietly adjusted their own work around the delays without ever reporting them, noticed immediately. Oliver mentioned it to George during their weekly review. 2 stewards asked Eliza whether similar adjustments could be made to other contracts. She said yes. She identified 4 more. George heard about the mill contract on a Wednesday afternoon. He did not congratulate Eliza publicly. That was not how either of them operated. But the following week, when he reviewed the quarterly accounts, he spent longer on the supply chain figures than he had spent on any other section. He read them twice. That evening he mentioned the mill contract at dinner. Efficient, he said. It was a single word. From George it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Eliza acknowledged it with a nod and moved on to the next item on her list. But she noted, privately, without commentary, that it was the first time George had addressed her work by name, in a room where no one else was listening, and meant it as recognition rather than instruction. It was a small thing. She filed it away precisely where it belonged, as evidence that the system was working. It started with the Denholm dispute. 2 tenants in the Western Holdings had a disagreement over a shared water source. It was not an unusual problem. Water rights in northern estates were contentious by nature, and the existing agreements were vague enough to support either party's position. Steward Marsh had handled such disputes before, usually by deferring to whoever had tenure longer and hoping the other party accepted it. This time, the other party did not accept it. The dispute escalated to a formal complaint, which meant it would need to be resolved on record, which meant someone with authority over both tenants would need to make a decision that could not later be challenged. George received the complaint on a Monday morning. He read it during breakfast. He set it down without resolution and spent the rest of the day on other matters: correspondence, a meeting with his solicitor, an inspection of the northern boundary wall. That evening he brought the complaint to the study where Eliza was working. "I would like your assessment," he said. It was not a casual request. George did not ask for opinions he did not intend to use. Eliza read the complaint carefully, asked 2 questions about the original lease terms, questions Marsh had not thought to ask, and provided a resolution within the hour. It was fair, it was defensible, and it addressed the underlying structural problem, rather than simply settling the surface argument. George implemented it the following day. The second time happened 3 weeks later, over a merchant contract. The third time, a week after that, over a boundary dispute with a neighboring estate. Each time, George brought the matter to Eliza. Each time, he listened to her assessment fully, before acting. Each time, his decision aligned with her recommendation, not because he deferred to her automatically, but because her reasoning was sound and he recognized it as such. Oliver noticed the pattern before anyone else did. He mentioned it to Eliza one afternoon, carefully. "He is asking you more often," Oliver said. Eliza did not look up from the ledger she was reviewing. "He is asking me when it is useful." "That is not the same thing." "Perhaps," Oliver said. "But he did not ask you at all 6 months ago." Eliza set down her pen. She looked at Oliver with the same measured attention she gave to a figure that did not yet add up. "No," she said. "He did not." She returned to the ledger. Oliver's observation stayed with her, not as a revelation, but as a data point she had not previously recorded. By spring, Eliza's days had a structure that left very little room in them. Mornings were for the accounts. The consolidated summaries now maintained on a weekly cycle that required her attention every Tuesday and Thursday. Afternoons were divided between tenant visits and meetings with Oliver and Theodore. both of whom had begun bringing her questions that would previously have gone unresolved for weeks. Evenings were for correspondence, letters to merchants, replies to steward reports, the ongoing negotiation of contracts that kept the supply chains functioning. The workload had grown the way a river grows in spring, not all at once but continuously, each tributary feeding into the next until the current was too wide to cross quickly. George noticed the change in November, though it had been developing since August. He came to the office one evening to discuss a matter regarding the eastern boundary, a minor adjustment that required her sign-off on the revised survey records. The office was empty. Eliza had left an hour earlier for a meeting with a merchant in the village and had not yet returned. He waited. He did not wait long, perhaps 15 minutes, but he noticed, with an exactitude he usually reserved for financial figures, that the wait felt longer than it should have. He left a note on her desk and went back to his own study. The following week, he asked Oliver where Eliza was on a Wednesday afternoon. Oliver checked his records. He had begun keeping a rough schedule of her movements, not out of suspicion, but out of practical necessity, and told George she was at the Northern Holdings, reviewing the new mill's first quarterly delivery report. When will she return? Tomorrow morning, most likely. George nodded. He returned to his own work without comment. But Oliver, who had known George for 4 years and had learned to read the silences between his sentences the way a navigator reads wind, noted that the Duke had asked the question with a directness that was new. It was not urgency. It was something quieter than that, closer to awareness. The awareness of a man who had, without intending to, begun to measure his days partly by the presence or absence of someone else. George had not planned to eat alone. It was not that he disliked solitary meals. He had taken most of his dinners alone for the better part of a decade, and had never found the practice uncomfortable. But since October, since Eliza had begun taking her place at the table across from him, the arrangement had become something he relied on without examining why. They did not discuss personal matters over dinner. The conversation stayed practical, estate business, upcoming decisions. But Eliza was a precise conversationalist. She listened without interrupting, asked questions that clarified rather than redirected, and occasionally offered an observation so accurate that George found himself reconsidering something he had already decided. On a Thursday in late autumn, he sat down at the dining table at the usual hour. The place setting across from him was laid but untouched. He waited 10 minutes, then 15. He sent a servant to inquire. Eliza had gone to the village that afternoon to meet with a merchant regarding the winter supply contracts. The meeting had run longer than expected. She had sent word, a short note, delivered by one of the village clerks. But it had arrived at the kitchen, not at the dining room, and no one had thought to bring it to George until after he had already been sitting alone for half an hour. He did not eat with anger. He ate with a quiet, unfamiliar discomfort, the kind that comes not from being wronged, but from noticing, for the first time, that something you had taken for granted had become necessary. The meal was fine. The food was good. The room was warm. None of it mattered particularly. When Eliza returned later that evening, she found his note on her desk, brief, factual, asking only whether the supply contracts had been finalized. She replied in writing, as she usually did when the hour was late. She did not apologize for missing dinner. It had not occurred to her that an apology was required. She had been working. He understood that. It was, after all, the arrangement they had agreed to. George read her reply before bed. He set it down on his nightstand and lay in the dark for longer than usual, not thinking about the supply contracts. He was thinking about the fact that he had noticed her absence before anything else about the evening, and that the noticing had not felt like a gap in his schedule. It had felt like a gap in something else, something he did not yet have precise language for, which was, for George, an unusual and deeply uncomfortable position to occupy. George arrived at conclusions the way he arrived at all conclusions, through accumulated evidence, reviewed until the only honest interpretation was the one he had been avoiding. He had noticed, over the past months, that his attention when Eliza spoke was different from the attention he gave anyone else. With Oliver or Theodore, he listened for information. With Eliza, he listened for something he could not isolate. A thread in her reasoning he wanted to follow, not because it was useful, but because it was hers. He had noticed, too, that her absence bothered him in a way that had nothing to do with the estate. On afternoons when she was away, the house felt less occupied than it actually was. On a Sunday morning in December, he reviewed these observations with the rigor he applied to financial data. The conclusion was not complicated. It was simply one he had not expected to reach. He wanted her attention, not her competence. He had that. He wanted the version of Eliza that existed when she was not working. The quiet version, the one that surfaced at dinner, or in the rare moments when conversation moved beyond the practical. He wanted more of it. He wanted it directed at him. He set down his coffee and began to think about what he was willing to do about it. It was December, a week before the solstice. The estate hosted a small winter gathering for the regional landowners, 30 guests, perhaps 40. George had always left the arrangements to his secretary. This year, he handled the details himself. He selected the menu, choosing dishes he had noticed Eliza favor at their private dinners. He ensured the room was arranged for conversation rather than spectacle. He asked Oliver whether Eliza had any preferences for the evening. Oliver raised an eyebrow, but answered without comment. George dressed with more care than he usually took. Not dramatically, but with a deliberateness that Oliver registered and said nothing about. Eliza came down late. She had been working in the office until the last possible moment, finishing a contract revision that could not wait until morning. She entered the gathering room composed, unhurried, wearing a dress of dark green that George had not seen before. She greeted the guests with the quiet efficiency that had become her signature. A few words to each, enough to be courteous, not enough to suggest she had planned to be the center of anything. George watched her from across the room. He had positioned himself near the fireplace, where he could see the full space without appearing to observe any one person in particular. At one point during the evening he moved toward her. The crowd was not large, but it was dense enough that the approach felt deliberate, something others might notice. He stopped beside her, offered her a glass of wine she had not asked for, and said something about the evening that was meant to convey, without stating it plainly, that he had put thought into making it pleasant for her. Eliza accepted the wine. She thanked him, politely, warmly, in the way one thanks a host for a well-organized event. She did not linger. She did not read anything into the gesture beyond what it was on its surface. A drink, offered at a party, by a husband who was being attentive in the way husbands sometimes were. She turned back to her conversation with Theodore's wife and did not look at George again for the rest of the evening. George finished his wine alone by the fireplace. He had miscalculated, not the gesture itself, but the assumption behind it. He had assumed that effort, applied correctly, would be noticed as effort. Eliza did not measure the world in terms of what people intended. She measured it in terms of what people did. From her perspective, he had done exactly what a husband might do at any winter gathering. Nothing more. George came to the office at the end of the afternoon, in January. Eliza was there, as she usually was, reviewing the quarterly figures. She looked up when he entered, set down her pen and waited. This was their established rhythm. He arrived with a purpose. She made space for it. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing to say it differently than he had spent a lifetime saying difficult things. "I made an error," he said, "on our wedding night. Not in what I offered you. The terms I gave were honest, and I stand by them. But I was wrong about something, and I want to correct it." "I told you not to expect love from me," George said. "I said that because I did not believe I was capable of it. I believed love was a performance, something people enacted because convention required it. I believed that a marriage built on competence and mutual respect was the strongest possible arrangement, and that anything beyond that was unnecessary. I was wrong, not about what we have built. That is real, and I would not dismantle any of it, but I was wrong to assume that what I felt toward you would stay within the boundaries I set. It did not. It has not, and I owe you the honesty of saying so. Because the alternative is to let you believe the terms of this marriage are still what I described on that first night. He did not qualify the statement or soften it. He let it exist as a fact he had stated, and waited. She was quiet for a moment, not because she needed time to process, because she was deciding how to respond, and the decision mattered to her. You are not asking me to change anything, she said. It was not a question. No. I am not asking you to feel something in return, or to alter how you live, or to give me something you have not chosen to give. I am simply telling you that the contract has changed, on my side, and that you deserve to know it. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way she nodded when a figure in a ledger finally resolved into the number she had expected. Thank you, she said, for telling me. George nodded. He stood and left the office. Spring came to Northumbria gradually, without announcement, in increments so small that no single day marked the change. George did not pursue Eliza. He did not court her in the way that men in Bradford understood courtship. No grand gestures, no declarations repeated until they landed, no escalation of effort designed to wear down resistance. He had already told her the truth. What remained was not persuasion. It was time. He began by being present, not intrusively. He simply stopped arranging his schedule to avoid overlap with hers. When she was in the office, he worked in the adjoining room. When she reviewed contracts in the evening, he sat in the same space, reading his own correspondence. They did not always speak. Sometimes an hour passed with nothing between them but the sound of paper and pen. He was there, consistently, without expectation. He noticed the things she enjoyed, the small ones. She read in the late afternoons, when the light came through the library windows at a particular angle. She preferred tea, unless the conversation genuinely engaged her. She liked problems that required patience more than speed. George made quiet adjustments. He ensured the library fire was lit before the afternoon light faded. He kept the tea she preferred stocked. When he brought her problems to discuss, he chose the ones whose shape matched the way her mind worked. Not because they required her expertise, but because he knew she would find them interesting. Eliza noticed. She was, above all things, a woman who noticed patterns. One evening in April, she was in the library when George came in with 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her without comment, and sat in the chair across from her, opening a letter of his own. They sat together for nearly an hour before either of them spoke. "George," Eliza said. She did not look up from her book. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual professional briskness. It was the voice she used when she was not performing for anyone. "Yes, I notice," she said. "What you are doing." He looked at her. The corner of her mouth had changed. Not a smile, but something close to one. "I know you do," George said. She turned a page. He returned to his letter. The fire burned steadily between them. Outside, the estate settled into evening, the tenants finishing their work, the stewards closing their ledgers, the supply chains running on the schedule Eliza had built. George understood for the first time what it meant to have built something worth returning to. Not because it needed him, because he wanted to be in it. Oliver Cranmore retired from the Northumbria estate in the spring of the following year, at the age of 52, with a pension that George had made generous enough to be unusual, and Eliza had quietly negotiated to be permanent. He moved to a smaller property on the eastern edge of the holdings, close enough to visit, far enough to have his own peace. On clear mornings he could see the main house from his garden, though he rarely looked in that direction with any particular interest. He had spent 4 years inside that house. He knew how it worked. Theodore Hale stayed on as land surveyor for another decade, and in that time watched the estate become one of the most efficiently run in the North. He attributed this, when asked, to neither George nor Eliza specifically. They built it together, he would say, and leave it at that. Charles Wentworth did not disappear. Men like Charles rarely did. He remained on the regional council, continued to advocate for tradition where tradition suited him, and gradually, over the course of 2 years, stopped raising objections to the Northumbria reforms. The reason was not conversion. It was pragmatism. The figures were too clear to argue against, and Charles, whatever else he was not a fool. He simply found other battles to fight, on other estates where the data had not yet been compiled so thoroughly. Oliver, when he heard this, remarked to no one in particular that it was the most honest form of defeat, the kind that required no acknowledgement. The first anniversary of the wedding arrived on a gray October morning, the same kind of morning the ceremony itself had been held on. Neither George nor Eliza marked it publicly. There was no gathering, no speech, no gesture designed for an audience. What happened was this. Eliza was in the library when George found her that evening. She was not working. This was unusual enough that he noticed it immediately. A book open in her lap, but her eyes were not on the page. She was looking at the fire, and there was something in the way she sat that was different from the way she usually occupied a room. Looser, quieter, as though she had, for once, set down every tool she carried and simply allowed herself to exist without purpose. George sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, close enough that the warmth between them was deliberate. He did not speak immediately. He simply sat and let the silence be what it was. Two people sharing a space they had both chosen to be in. After a while, Eliza set the book down. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said in January. About the contract changing." George turned to look at her. She met his eyes, directly, without the measured caution she brought to every other exchange in her life. This was not the woman who read contracts for accuracy. This was the woman underneath that woman. The one who had been there all along, waiting not to be discovered, but to be given a reason to step forward. "It changed on my side, too," she said. "Sometime between the ledgers and the mill contract, and all the quiet evenings you spent in the same room as me without asking for anything." She paused, not from uncertainty, but from the care she took with precision. "I did not expect it, but I would not undo it." George looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate care he brought to everything that mattered to him. His fingers closed around hers. Her hand was warm. She did not pull away. She did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down. Two people who had begun as a contract and ended as something neither of them had the vocabulary to name precisely, but both of them, for the first time, had no need to. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story kept you on your seat, if you felt that slow, quiet pull toward these two people and the life they built together, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs a story where love is not handed over, but earned one careful, honest act at a time. The next story is already being written. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching.